Frank Dalton walked up the perimeter road of the Marine Corps base just as the late afternoon sun began to dip behind the distant hills. His steps were slow but purposeful, each one marked with the quiet determination of a man who had lived a long life but carried a fire inside that refused to dim. He wore a faded olive-green jacket, sleeves slightly frayed, and on the left arm, partially hidden by the folds of cloth, was a small, unusual patch. The black falcon with silver streaks, so worn that only someone who had seen one before would recognize its significance, marked him as a man whose past was more than just ordinary. At the gate, a group of young Marines were leaning casually against the guard posts, checking their phones and joking loudly. The sight of an elderly man approaching them drew immediate laughter, hushed at first and then louder as the men realized he was making his way straight to the booth. One of them, a tall Marine with a mop of sandy hair, raised an eyebrow and nudged his friend. "Watch this," he whispered, grinning. "Old guy thinks he belongs here." Frank stopped just short of the gate and lifted a hand in polite greeting. His voice, calm yet carrying a firmness that demanded attention, said, "Good afternoon, sirs. I wonder if I could borrow a rifle for an hour." The laughter erupted instantly. One Marine leaned against the metal gate, arms crossed, shaking his head. "Did you hear that?" he said, voice cracking with amusement. "He wants a rifle. Do you even remember how to hold one, Grandpa?" The others snickered, some leaning back to get a better view of what they assumed would be a comical interaction. Frank's eyes didn't waver. He didn't chuckle, he didn't plead. He simply waited, hands behind his back, watching. His face was lined, weathered by years of sun, wind, and countless unknown battles, but his eyes were sharp, steady, and filled with the sort of quiet authority that comes from experience. One Marine, trying to stifle laughter, muttered, "He looks like my grandfather, if my grandfather knew how to tie his shoes." Frank finally spoke again calmly, without raising his voice. "A rifle will do, thank you." The words were simple, but there was a weight behind them, a sense of knowledge that the men could feel even if they didn't understand it. They paused, unsure of how to respond. The humor that had filled the space now met a quiet resistance, and for a moment the air between them seemed to thrum with tension. "You're joking, right?" another Marine said, trying to regain control of the situation. "This is a military base, old man. You don't just stroll up and ask for weapons." He laughed again, but the sound was slightly uncertain now. Frank didn't reply, only inclined his head slightly, the hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't an inviting smile, not a friendly one. It was the smile of someone who had been underestimated too many times and knew exactly how to wait. "Check his sleeve," muttered a quieter voice from behind the group, but most ignored it. To them it was just a patch on a jacket, something faded, probably meaningless. Frank's jacket was old, his pants slightly too loose and his shoes worn. He looked the part of a man who had retired into anonymity, blending into civilian life, forgotten by the world he had once fought for. That was precisely the point. One Marine, feeling emboldened, decided to push further. "So you just wake up one morning and decide you want a rifle. Do you want a chair too? Maybe a cot in the barracks?" His laughter filled the air again, though this time it sounded hollow. Frank shifted slightly, just enough to show he was listening, and replied, "I don't need a chair. I've stood longer than most of you will in your lives." The comment landed like a cold wind, brushing against the laughter and leaving a strange silence in its wake. From inside the gatehouse, a logistics officer glanced out. He froze, staring at the patch on Frank's sleeve. It was small, faded, and partially hidden, but he recognized it immediately. The black falcon with silver streaks belonged to a highly classified recon unit from decades past, a unit officially listed as disbanded, whose missions were considered some of the most dangerous in Marine history. The officer's mind raced. Could it be? He had heard the rumors, the whispered stories, the legends. But none of the men in that unit were supposed to be alive. Not Frank Dalton, not this man standing at the gate asking for a rifle. The young Marines, oblivious to the recognition happening inside the office, continued to mock him. "Old man, are you going to load it yourself, or do you want us to show you how?" one sneered. Frank's calm demeanor never broke. He simply waited, his eyes scanning the group, Not threatening, not pleading, just quietly observing. Every man could feel it, the kind of presence that didn't need to shout to command respect. A moment passed, long enough that the laughter faded. A few Marines exchanged uncertain glances. The one who had tried to mock him first was fidgeting, suddenly aware that there was something he didn't understand. Frank's silence was louder than any words. His posture, his gaze, the weight of the life he carried, all of it conveyed that he had lived in worlds the young men could not imagine. They had been laughing at a man who could have taught them more in 1 hour than they had learned in years. Inside the gatehouse, the logistics officer was on the phone, speaking in hurried tones to base command. "Sir, I think it's him. Frank Dalton, Master Sergeant Dalton, the last surviving member of the Falcon Recon Unit." His words barely made sense to the listener. "Yes, the patch, I'm telling you, the patch is real. He's here." He hung up, heart pounding. Orders would come, but until then, Frank waited, unaware that he had already shifted the entire energy of the base with nothing more than his quiet presence. The Marines at the gate continued to watch him. Some still laughed, though the laughter was now cautious, tinged with nervous curiosity. One of the more observant men whispered, "There's something about him I don't know. He's different." Frank tilted his head slightly as if acknowledging the remark and continued to wait. He wasn't asking for attention. He wasn't demanding respect. He simply knew the world still had things that needed to be done, and he had come to do one of them. Finally, one of the guards, slightly embarrassed by the attention Frank had drawn, stepped forward. "Sir, I think we need to call someone," he stammered, unsure what the protocol was. Frank nodded, a faint smile crossing his face. "I don't need an introduction, only a rifle." The words were quiet but resolute. He had not come to argue, to explain, or to prove anything. He had come to act, and for Frank Dalton, action had always spoken louder than words. And so he stood there under the late sun, patch hidden only partially from view, waiting for a world that didn't yet understand who he truly was. The young Marines had laughed. They didn't know it yet, but that laughter was about to end. The young Marines at the gate were still trying to contain their laughter, though an uneasy tension had begun creeping into the edges of their humor. The first chuckles had faded, replaced by awkward glances toward one another. Something about Frank Dalton unsettled them, though they could not yet put their fingers on it. He stood with a calm patience that contrasted sharply with their restless energy, and for the first time, a flicker of doubt appeared in the bravado they had worn like armor. Corporal Jensen, a lanky young Marine with a quick wit and a nervous energy, was the first to notice the subtle signs. The faint limp, the steady gaze, the quiet authority in Frank's stance, these were not the marks of a man confused, frail, or out of place. They were the hallmarks of someone who had seen far more than any of them would in their entire careers. He nudged his buddy, whispering, "Hey, I don't know, man. There's something about him. You feel it too." The other Marine shrugged, trying to hide the growing sense of unease. "It's just an old man. Don't get all spooked over nothing," he said, though his voice wavered. Frank remained silent, and the tension stretched across the air like an invisible wire. He didn't need to speak to assert himself. The weight of his presence alone shifted the dynamics around him. Each young Marine began to feel it differently. The ones who had laughed the loudest now glanced down, uncomfortable. The ones who had been quiet initially began to inch backward, a creeping realization settling over them. They were not dealing with an ordinary retiree. They were dealing with someone who commanded attention without saying a word. "Old man," a taller Marine finally blurted out, trying to regain his dominance, "you even remember how to shoot one of these things." He gestured vaguely at the base beyond the gate, where weapons were securely kept. The laugh that followed was forced, a thin attempt to fill the silence. Frank tilted his head slightly, a hint of a knowing smile appearing on his lips. "I've fired more rifles than you've ever seen," he said quietly, but the words carried a subtle weight that caused the Marine to falter mid-laugh. The others stopped laughing as well, sensing that the calm authority in Frank's tone was not something to be dismissed lightly. A slight wind blew across the base, rustling the dry grass at the edge of the road. The young Marines shifted on their feet, their playful mockery slowly giving way to curiosity and caution. One of them, Private Sanders, whispered to his friend, "There's something about him. I can feel it. Look at his hands, look at his posture. He's different." The laughter had dwindled, replaced by an odd silence filled with small, uncertain movements. Frank remained patient, unmoving, his gaze scanning the group with quiet intensity. Each Marine felt as though he could read their thoughts, as if he had done this many times before. They were not dealing with a confused elderly man. They were standing in front of a veteran whose life had been forged under conditions they could scarcely imagine. Meanwhile, inside the gatehouse, the logistics officer had gone pale. He had finally gotten a full glimpse of the patch on Frank's sleeve, now partially visible as the wind tugged at his jacket. His heart pounded in his chest. The black falcon with silver streaks was unmistakable. It belonged to a top-secret recon unit, one that had been classified for decades. Only a handful of men had ever carried that symbol, and most were long presumed dead. The officer picked up the phone and spoke hurriedly, barely suppressing his shock. "Sir, you need to see this. Yes, him, Master Sergeant Dalton, the Falcon unit. Yes, alive, he's here." His words spilled out quickly, urgent and disbelieving. On the other end of the line, base command stirred into immediate action. Orders would come, but for now, Frank waited quietly, unaware of the flurry of activity he had ignited. Back at the gate, the Marines sensed something shifting. The laughter had completely vanished, replaced by a growing tension. Frank's presence, once amusing, now commanded their attention. One Marine shifted nervously, muttering under his breath, "Why isn't he saying more? Why isn't he arguing?" Another shook his head, feeling a pang of fear he didn't fully understand. They had mocked him at their own peril, but the rules of engagement had already changed, though they hadn't realized it yet. The wind picked up again, blowing dust across the pavement. Frank adjusted the fold of his sleeve, making the patch more visible. It was subtle, almost accidental, but enough to catch the eye of Corporal Jensen. The black falcon with silver streaks, though faded, spoke volumes to someone who had studied military insignias. Jensen swallowed hard, the first stirrings of realization dawning on him. "Guys, I think we might have underestimated him," he whispered. Frank finally spoke again, breaking the silence without raising his voice. "I don't need a chair. I've stood longer than most of you will in your lives," he said, his words deliberate, calm, and carrying the weight of decades. The statement wasn't a boast. It was a simple fact, one that immediately grounded the Marines in the reality of who they were facing. The group at the gate fell completely silent. Even the ones who had been the loudest could feel it, the subtle, unshakable presence of a man who had endured more than they could comprehend. Their laughter had died the moment his words hung in the air, replaced by a growing awareness that they were no longer in a position to mock or dismiss him. A few moments later, the logistics officer, still pale and nervous, exited the gatehouse and approached the commanding officers. "Sir, it's him. Dalton. Master Sergeant Dalton. The Falcon Recon Unit, he's here, asking for a rifle," he said, urgency creeping into his voice. The officers exchanged glances, recognition flashing in their eyes. This was no ordinary visitor, and it was clear that immediate action was needed to respond appropriately. Meanwhile, Frank continued to stand patiently, unbothered by the flurry of activity inside the gatehouse. He had learned long ago that patience was a weapon as powerful as any rifle. Time, in his world, revealed truth, and it was only a matter of time before the Marines would understand that they were in the presence of someone extraordinary. The young men shifted uneasily, sensing that the dynamic had changed. One of them whispered, There's something about him. I can feel it. He's not just some old guy." Another nodded slightly, swallowing hard. The energy that had once been filled with amusement had transformed into a quiet tension, an unspoken acknowledgement that Frank Dalton was a man they could not simply dismiss. The sun continued its slow descent, casting long shadows across the base. Frank adjusted his jacket and took a step forward. He didn't need to raise his voice, make threats, or assert authority. His mere presence demanded recognition. The patch on his sleeve, partially visible now, hinted at a history so extraordinary that it had been hidden from all but the most informed. The young Marines, who had begun the day mocking him, now stood with an unspoken reverence, their minds racing to comprehend the man before them. Finally, the base commander arrived at the gate, walking briskly toward Frank with a mixture of curiosity and urgency. He had been briefed, but he needed to see the man for himself. The other Marines fell silent, unsure how to react. Frank, still calm, nodded in acknowledgement to the commander. His request remained simple and unchanged. "I only need a rifle for an hour." No fuss, no ego, just purpose. And in that moment, standing at the edge of a world that didn't yet understand him, Frank Dalton became a quiet storm, a figure whose life and actions would soon reshape every assumption the young Marines had made. The laughter was gone. The tension was palpable, and the story of a man who had lived through extraordinary circumstances was just beginning to unfold. Inside the gatehouse, the logistics officer stared at Frank Dalton with disbelief. That small, faded patch on the old man's sleeve, a black falcon with silver streaks, was unmistakable. He had seen it only in classified files, in faded photographs of men who had belonged to the Falcon Recon Unit. The unit was legendary and feared, but also officially disbanded decades ago. Most believed the members had perished on missions that were never spoken of, missions buried deep in classified archives. And yet here he was, alive, standing calmly at the gate, asking for a rifle as if nothing extraordinary had ever happened. The officer's hands trembled slightly as he reached for the phone, dialing the base command number. "Sir, yes. You need to see this. It's Dalton, Master Sergeant Dalton, the Falcon Recon Unit," he stammered, voice rising as he tried to convey the gravity of what he was witnessing. "He's asking for a rifle for an hour. Yes, sir, alive." As he spoke, Frank stood silently outside, unmoved by the murmurs and the shifting tension among the young Marines. The wind tugged at his jacket, revealing the patch more clearly. The symbol, once feared in distant theaters of war, now worn by a man in his 70s, radiated authority without a word being spoken. The young Marines exchanged glances, unease creeping into their expressions. Some shifted their feet nervously, realizing that their mockery from earlier was not only misplaced, it could be dangerous. Corporal Jensen, who had felt the first twinge of doubt earlier, now could see it fully. "Guys, that patch, it's not just some old insignia," he whispered to Private Sanders, his voice barely audible. That's the Falcon Recon Unit. He's one of them." Sanders froze, eyes wide, trying to grasp the magnitude of what was being said. The others, too, now sensed it. The laughter that had filled the gate moments ago had vanished, replaced by an eerie, expectant silence. Meanwhile, inside the office, the phone call had set a chain of events into motion. Base Command was mobilizing, calling in officers who had knowledge of the Falcon Recon Unit. Files were retrieved, photographs examined, and orders dispatched. The name Master Sergeant Frank Dalton elicited immediate attention and respect. No one at the base had seen him in decades. Few believed he was still alive. Yet the evidence was undeniable. The black falcon patch had been worn on the sleeve of a man standing calmly at the gate, asking politely for a rifle. Outside, Frank remained a study in quiet patience. He didn't boast, he didn't plead, and he didn't argue. He had no need to prove his identity to the young Marines who had laughed at him. The patch alone carried a history that spoke louder than any words, and yet, to the officers and veterans who recognized it, the weight of his presence was almost unbearable. He was a living reminder of missions that were shrouded in secrecy, a relic of an era that had shaped the Marine Corps in ways few could understand. One of the young Marines, attempting to mask his growing unease, muttered, I think we should let him go." His voice faltered, betraying the respect and fear he suddenly felt. Jensen, now fully aware of the truth, nodded subtly. "Yeah, maybe this isn't the guy to mess with." The realization sank in slowly, leaving a heavy silence among the group. Suddenly, a vehicle approached from the command area. The sound of tires crunching against the gravel road brought a sense of urgency. Out stepped General Matthew Ross, his stern expression immediately commanding attention. Even at a distance, Frank's posture shifted slightly, not out of surprise but in acknowledgement. The general's reputation preceded him, a man who demanded order, precision, and respect. Yet even Ross paused as he took in the figure at the gate. The Marines who had laughed hours ago now snapped to attention, confusion etched across their faces. This was no ordinary visitor. This was history walking up to them in real time. General Ross approached slowly, eyes fixed on the patch that had already set the entire command structure into motion. He stopped a few feet from Frank, saluted sharply, and said, "Master Sergeant Dalton." His voice carried a weight that silenced every lingering whisper, every thought of mockery. Frank returned the salute, a small, respectful nod that conveyed acknowledgement without ceremony. "General," he said simply, his voice steady and calm. The gravity of the moment was not lost on anyone present. The young Marines stared in disbelief. They had mocked a man they didn't know, unaware that they were standing before one of the most respected and legendary figures in modern Marine history. Ross studied Frank for a moment, scanning the faded lines on his face, the scarred hands folded behind his back, and the patch that had become an icon of courage and secrecy. "I never thought I'd see you again," the general said softly. There was a hint of emotion in his tone, carefully controlled but undeniable. "The world thought you were gone. Your unit," he paused, his words heavy with unspoken history. We've all been waiting too long for this day." The logistics officer, still shaking slightly, muttered, "Sir, he asked for a rifle for an hour, nothing else. He doesn't even seem to know." The general nodded slowly, a faint smile crossing his lips. "I know," he said. "That's exactly how Dalton works. He doesn't need recognition, he acts." Meanwhile, the young Marines could only watch in stunned silence. The laughter that had filled the gate was completely gone, replaced by awe, curiosity, and a dawning understanding. They had been confronted not with a harmless old man, but with a living legend whose actions had once shaped the course of countless missions. The air was heavy, charged with anticipation, as if the very ground beneath them recognized the significance of the moment. Frank's calm demeanor never wavered. He wasn't here for accolades or attention. He had a purpose, and it was simple: a rifle for 1 hour. Yet the implications of his presence reverberated far beyond that request. The general's gaze lingered on the patch, acknowledging the courage, skill, and sacrifice it represented. Every Marine in sight could feel it, the presence of someone who had faced dangers they could scarcely imagine, whose life had been defined by courage, precision, and loyalty. Corporal Jensen whispered to a nearby private, I think we've been in the presence of history, and we didn't even know it." The private nodded slowly, eyes wide, feeling the weight of their ignorance and the gravity of the lesson unfolding before them. They had been foolish in their laughter, but the universe had a way of humbling the unprepared, and today it was teaching them exactly that. As General Ross continued to speak quietly with Frank, discussing logistics and confirming identities, the other officers moved swiftly to ensure that the base responded appropriately. Security was tightened, protocols were adjusted, and the entire unit began to recognize the extraordinary nature of the visitor they were now hosting. Frank Dalton's mere presence reshaped the energy of the base, turning routine drills into a moment of reverence and history coming alive. Outside, the young Marines shifted nervously, realizing they had been wrong. Mockery was replaced by respect. Fear was tempered by awe, and the laughter that had once seemed so natural now felt like a distant memory, replaced by an unspoken understanding. Frank Dalton was a man who had lived a life beyond imagination, whose past was a testament to bravery, skill, and sacrifice. The wind tugged again at Frank's jacket, revealing the patch once more. In that moment, the significance of the Falcon Recon Unit was no longer theoretical. It was living, breathing, and standing right in front of them. The young Marines could sense it. The general could see it. Even the officer on the phone could feel it through the tension that radiated across the base. Frank Dalton had arrived simply to request a rifle for an hour. Yet, in doing so, He had reminded everyone present that true courage does not seek recognition, and true legends do not announce themselves. They are revealed by the quiet weight of their presence. And in that silence, history was no longer confined to dusty files and faded photographs. It was alive, palpable, and waiting to continue its story. The gravel crunched beneath the tires of the convoy as it rolled toward the base gate, a stark contrast to the tense silence that had settled over the young Marines. Inside the lead vehicle, General Matthew Ross sat upright, his hands clasped tightly on his knees. Briefed hastily about the man at the gate, he had heard only fragments: an elderly veteran requesting a rifle, a small patch worn on his sleeve, and the whispered confirmation from a logistics officer that the man was Master Sergeant Frank Dalton, last known member of the Falcon Recon Unit. Ross's brow furrowed as he surveyed the horizon through the windshield. He had served for decades and seen many strange occurrences, but nothing prepared him for the weight of history arriving in person. "If it's him, I need to see it with my own eyes," he muttered to himself, voice low and tense. The convoy slowed, and Ross stepped down with the precision and authority that defined him. Every movement was controlled, every gesture deliberate. He walked toward the gate with purpose, eyes fixed firmly on the figure waiting there. The young Marines at the gate stiffened as they noticed the arrival of the convoy. Some snapped to attention, still struggling to process the gravity of the situation. Their earlier laughter had long faded, replaced by a mixture of fear, curiosity, and reverence. Frank Dalton stood as he had all along, calm, patient, unwavering, the subtle sway of his posture exuding quiet command. The black falcon patch on his sleeve seemed almost to shimmer under the afternoon sun, an emblem of countless untold missions and sacrifices. General Ross approached slowly, the gravel crunching under his boots echoing across the quiet base. The tension was palpable, like the taut string of a bow about to release. He stopped a few feet from Frank, lifted his hand sharply, and saluted. "Master Sergeant Dalton," he said, his tone steady but weighted with emotion. The words carried decades of respect, unspoken stories, and recognition of deeds performed in shadows, far from public knowledge. Frank returned the salute, a slight nod acknowledging both the general and the moment itself. "General," he replied simply, voice calm and controlled. The brevity of the exchange belied the significance. Those present could feel it, the weight of history converging in that brief acknowledgement. The young Marines, who had mocked him hours earlier, felt an almost physical jolt. They were witnessing a living legend being recognized by the man at the pinnacle of authority. The general's eyes scanned Frank's face, taking in the deep lines etched by time and conflict, the scarred hands folded behind his back, and the steady gaze that had unsettled the youngest Marines. "I never thought I'd see you again," Ross said quietly, as if speaking to an old friend long believed lost. "The world thought you were gone. Your unit, the Falcon Recon Unit, your team, we've all wondered what became of you." Frank Dalton's expression remained composed. There was no need to defend, no need to explain. "I've been where I needed to be," he said simply, "and now I'm here." His words were deliberate, calm, and conveyed a lifetime of experience in just a few syllables. The Marines at the gate felt the weight of those words, sensing that Frank's life had been lived in ways beyond their comprehension. Ross gestured for the other officers and logistics personnel to approach. Inside the gatehouse, a flurry of activity had already begun. Communications were buzzing, files pulled, confirmations sought. The realization that Frank Dalton, the last known member of a unit steeped in secrecy and danger, was standing before them demanded immediate coordination. Orders were being prepared to accommodate him, though Frank had asked for nothing more than a rifle for 1 hour. Outside, the young Marines continued to observe in awe. The initial laughter was a distant memory, replaced by an understanding that they were no longer in control of the moment. They had underestimated Frank Dalton, and in doing so, had encountered the full force of respect due to a man whose life had been defined by skill, courage, and quiet leadership. Even the bravest among them could feel the tension, the unspoken warning that this was a man to be approached with respect, not humor. General Ross stepped closer, his gaze fixed on the patch that had sparked the entire chain of recognition. "I remember the missions," he said softly, almost to himself. "I remember the reports, the debriefs, the risks taken that no one else could handle." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "And now you're here." The quiet reverence in his voice was unmistakable. He wasn't simply acknowledging Frank's presence, he was honoring it. Frank Dalton inclined his head slightly, acknowledging both the general and the significance of his past. He had lived decades without recognition, had executed missions with precision and bravery, and had carried the weight of his actions silently. Now all of that weight was recognized in a single moment of acknowledgement. And yet Frank remained humble. He had no desire for accolades or praise. His purpose was singular, the rifle he had requested, and the task that brought him here. The logistics officer, still pale and anxious, whispered to the base commander, "Sir, he doesn't even seem to realize the stir he's caused. He just stands there." The base commander nodded gravely, understanding fully. Frank Dalton's quiet presence was more commanding than any ceremony or salute. He had arrived not to assert himself, but simply to act, and that was enough. The young Marines shuffled uneasily, some glancing at one another with nervous expressions. The weight of history pressed down on them in the form of a man who had lived through extraordinary circumstances. Frank's calm patience, combined with the authority suggested by the patch on his sleeve, was almost tangible. They had mocked him, doubted him, and laughed at him. But now, all of that seemed like childish folly. General Ross took a deep breath, then lowered his voice, speaking directly to Frank. "Your unit, your team, they're legends, Sergeant. The Falcon Recon Unit set a standard that few could ever match. And yet here you are asking only for a rifle, nothing more, no accolades, no attention, just a task." Frank nodded, acknowledging both the general's words and the unspoken understanding between men who had shared battles, though not necessarily side by side. The wind tugged at Frank's jacket once more, exposing the patch in full view. The black falcon with silver streaks, a symbol of secrecy, skill, and courage, gleamed under the fading sunlight. For the young Marines, it was a revelation. They had been standing before a man whose life had been defined by extraordinary danger, relentless discipline, and unmatched expertise. The gravity of that realization pressed on them, a humbling contrast to their earlier amusement. Frank Dalton remained patient, allowing the tension to settle. His purpose had not changed, but the awareness of those around him had. The general, the officers, the young Marines, everyone present had been reminded that true strength is quiet, enduring, and often invisible until the right moment. And now, the right moment had arrived. The general gestured toward the gatehouse, indicating that Frank would be escorted for further coordination and access to the base facilities he required. "We'll make arrangements," Ross said. "But I need you to know your presence here is more than a visit. It's a reminder of everything our Corps stands for." Frank Dalton nodded once, silently acknowledging the words. He had no need for recognition, no desire for fanfare. His mission, his purpose was clear. He had come for one reason and nothing else mattered. The young Marines at the gate had been silenced not by fear, but by the realization of their own ignorance. They had glimpsed history alive and walking among them, and it had humbled them completely. As Frank was escorted past the gate, the young Marines watched silently. The laughter was gone. The previous mockery had dissolved into awe, respect, and a quiet curiosity about the man they had once underestimated. General Ross followed, speaking softly to Frank, discussing logistics, access, and the rifle he had requested. But to everyone observing, it was clear. This was no ordinary visit. This was history in motion, a living legend moving through the world he had helped shape, quiet and unassuming, yet undeniable in authority. And as Frank Dalton walked into the base proper, escorted by the highest authority present, the air seemed to hum with anticipation. The story that had begun as a simple request, a rifle for 1 hour, was unfolding into a lesson in respect, courage, and the enduring power of action over words. The escorted walk through the base was quiet but charged with tension. Frank Dalton moved steadily, his eyes taking in the familiar layout of the training grounds, the barracks, the armory, all seemingly unchanged from years past. The young Marines who had once laughed at him now fell silent, standing at attention wherever they could glimpse him passing by. Each step Frank took seemed to draw a deeper sense of respect from those observing. The black falcon patch on his sleeve, once nearly invisible to the untrained eye, now stood out as a symbol of quiet authority and extraordinary history. General Ross walked alongside him, his own expression a mixture of respect and curiosity. "You've been gone a long time, Sergeant," he said, his voice low, almost conversational. "We thought we'd lost you. Your unit, your missions, most of us never fully understood what you endured." Frank Dalton merely nodded, his expression calm. He didn't speak immediately. There was no need. The general understood that Frank's actions and presence communicated far more than words could. Finally, they reached the armory, and the commanding officer assigned to coordinate Frank's request approached nervously. "Master Sergeant Dalton, we'll have a rifle ready for you, as requested," he said, trying to maintain composure. His voice wavered slightly, betraying the tension he felt being in the presence of a legend. Frank glanced at him briefly and nodded, appreciative of the efficiency but unfazed by the formality. Once inside the small briefing room adjacent to the armory, Frank's reason for being there began to unfold. He took a deep breath, his eyes softening as they met the general's. "I didn't come for recognition," he began, voice calm but firm. "I came because of family. My grandson, he's a recruit here. He's struggling with marksmanship. He's failed twice already and he doesn't know who I am. He doesn't understand what I've done, what I've been through. I only came to give him the guidance he needs, to help him succeed." A murmur ran through the officers present. They had expected Frank's visit to be about his own legacy, perhaps a demonstration of skill, or even a request to revisit old memories. Yet the reason he gave was so simple, so personal, that it struck a chord with everyone listening. The general's eyes softened, recognizing a kind of humility and dedication that had defined Frank Dalton's life. "You don't need to show him," Ross replied quietly. "You've already inspired more than you know, but if it's guidance he needs, then I understand why you're here." Frank nodded once, his posture relaxed but deliberate. "I'm not here for medals or stories," he said. "I've lived with the memories of missions that no one else can know. I don't need recognition. I only want to show him what is possible, to give him confidence. That's all." The young Marines outside the room, still observing, felt a shift in their perception of Frank. What had been a man to mock, a figure of amusement, was now a teacher, a mentor, and a living embodiment of discipline, skill, and quiet authority. They began to understand why the logistics officer had been so alarmed by the patch, why the general had arrived, and why the entire atmosphere of the base had changed in a matter of minutes. Frank's calm demeanor, his refusal to boast, and his singular purpose were the hallmarks of someone who had been tested in circumstances most could scarcely imagine. He had faced life-and-death situations that required absolute precision, unwavering courage, and total trust in one's own abilities. And yet now, decades later, he was here to provide guidance, not to prove himself, but to lift the next generation. The general, still standing close to Frank, spoke again. "Your unit's history, the Falcon Recon Unit, it's more than legend. The missions you and your team undertook, most would have faltered. Few could have succeeded. And yet here you are, wanting only to help your grandson. That says more about you than any medal ever could." Frank allowed a faint smile to cross his face, not prideful but gentle. "He doesn't even know my history," he said quietly. "I've never spoken about the missions, the operations, or the sacrifices. He thinks I'm just a retired Marine, and that's fine. I only want to show him that he can do this, whatever this is, however hard it seems." At that moment, a young Marine emerged from the hallway, the recruit himself, unaware that his grandfather had returned. His brow was furrowed, anxiety evident in every line of his face. He had struggled in previous marksmanship tests, and the failures weighed heavily on him. He glanced at the group of older officers, then toward Frank, and felt an inexplicable tug of curiosity. He didn't recognize the man at first. To him, Frank looked like a visitor, an old veteran, nothing more. Yet there was something in his eyes, something that demanded attention, that radiated a quiet confidence. Frank saw him and extended a hand, not in command, not in intimidation, but in connection. "Son," he said, voice calm and steady, "we're going to make this work." The words were simple, but their weight was extraordinary. The recruit looked at him, unsure, sensing the gravity of the moment without fully understanding it. General Ross watched the interaction, a faint smile on his lips. He understood the importance of this encounter, not for the legacy of the Falcon Recon Unit, but for the legacy of mentorship, guidance, and the quiet transfer of skill from one generation to another. Frank Dalton had come not to relive history, but to shape the future. The young Marines who had watched from the sidelines felt an unusual mix of awe and humility. They had seen history alive, but now they were witnessing something more, the embodiment of dedication, skill, and compassion. Frank's purpose was clear, and it was as formidable as any mission he had ever undertaken. "Let's go to the range," Frank said, nodding toward the training area. "I'll show you what's possible." There was no boast in his tone, only certainty. The recruit followed hesitantly, unsure what to expect but feeling an unusual surge of hope. The other Marines watched, understanding that this hour would not be ordinary, it would be transformative. The general stepped back slightly, giving Frank space. "I'll observe," Ross said quietly, "but this is yours to lead. Teach him what he needs to know." Frank nodded, and the two of them began walking toward the range, the gravel crunching softly beneath their feet. The young Marines followed at a respectful distance, curiosity and admiration etched into every movement. As they approached the firing line, Frank picked up the rifle with a practiced hand, inspecting it as if it were an extension of himself. His movements were precise, effortless, and filled with the authority of decades of experience. The recruit watched wide-eyed as Frank demonstrated the proper stance, grip, and breath control. The quiet patience and skill with which he handled the weapon left no doubt. This was a man who had mastered not only firearms, but the art of teaching through action. And so, the reason for Frank Dalton's visit became clear. It was not recognition, not a return to glory, not a reminder of past achievements. It was a simple, profound purpose: to guide the next generation, to instill confidence and skill, to ensure that what he had learned through a lifetime of challenges would not be lost. It was mentorship in its purest form, wrapped in the calm, deliberate presence of a man who had faced death more times than most could imagine. The young recruit, initially hesitant and anxious, began to mirror Frank's stance, mimicking his careful movements. The first shot rang out, and though imperfect, it carried the promise of potential unlocked. Frank offered encouragement without condescension, correction without criticism, and the quiet force of a lifetime of discipline. Each word, each gesture, each instruction was a bridge between history and the present, between experience and learning, between legend and the next generation. And as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the training grounds, it became clear to everyone present. Frank Dalton had not come to relive his past. He had come to shape the future, and in doing so, he would leave an indelible mark, not through medals or ceremonies, but through the quiet empowerment of a young Marine ready to discover what was possible. The sun was low on the horizon, casting long, sharp shadows across the base's firing range as Frank Dalton positioned himself at the line. His grandson, Private Alex Dalton, stood hesitantly beside him, gripping the rifle like it was a foreign object. Sweat dotted the boy's brow, his hands trembling slightly. He had failed the marksmanship test twice, and the fear of failure was pressing down on him like a physical weight. Yet the presence of his grandfather, this living legend, offered a strange mixture of intimidation and hope. Frank glanced at him with calm eyes. "Relax your shoulders, breathe, control the weapon, don't let it control you," he instructed, voice steady but filled with authority. He didn't scold, he didn't demand perfection. Every word was deliberate, a bridge from decades of experience to the uncertain hands of the next generation. Alex mimicked his grandfather's stance, tentative at first, then more deliberate as Frank corrected his posture with gentle adjustments. Around them, the young Marines and officers watched silently. The tension that had gripped the base since Frank's arrival had not dissipated. If anything, it had deepened. They had come expecting a simple visit, perhaps a demonstration, maybe even a ceremonial moment. What they were witnessing now was something far more profound. Mastery, discipline, and guidance fused into a display of skill that spoke louder than words. Frank picked up the rifle, inspecting it with a practiced eye. Each movement was precise, economical, and filled with authority. "The rifle is an extension of your body," he said, placing it gently into Alex's hands. "Feel it, respect it, and it will serve you. Ignore it, and it will fail you every time." He guided Alex's hands to the proper grip, his own movements smooth and deliberate. The boy's nervousness was palpable, but he began to mirror Frank's movements, his breathing slowing as he concentrated. The first shot rang out, echoing across the range. It missed the target slightly, but Frank did not scold him. Instead, he adjusted Alex's stance subtly, demonstrating with patience how minute changes could produce drastic improvements. He fired once himself, a single, perfect shot, and the young Marines instinctively flinched. The bullet struck dead center. The precision, the calm efficiency, the authority in the shot, it was nothing short of astonishing. Alex's eyes widened. How did you do that?" he whispered, awe evident in his voice. Frank didn't answer with words. Instead, he simply handed the rifle back to Alex and gestured him forward. "Your turn," he said, tone calm but commanding. The boy lifted the rifle, trying to replicate the stance, the breathing, the focus he had just witnessed. The first few shots went wide, but Frank's patience never wavered. He corrected, guided, demonstrated, and allowed Alex to feel each adjustment. Slowly, steadily, the boy began to find a rhythm. Each shot grew closer to the center, each adjustment more precise. The transformation was remarkable, not just in the technical improvement but in the confidence that began to radiate from him. The young Marines who had once mocked Frank were now completely silent. Their eyes followed every movement, their respect deepening with each demonstration. They had underestimated him hours earlier, and now they understood the full extent of his skill and discipline. It was not just the accuracy of his shots that impressed them. It was the way he commanded attention, demanded focus, and transferred knowledge without raising his voice or seeking recognition. Frank turned to General Ross briefly. "He'll make it," he said simply, nodding toward Alex. Ross watched, silently acknowledging the quiet authority and unparalleled skill of the man beside him. The general had seen many soldiers excel in marksmanship, but few, if any, had demonstrated the calm, deliberate guidance that Frank was providing. It was a lesson not just in skill, but in leadership, patience, and the transmission of knowledge across generations. As the session continued, Alex's confidence grew. His breathing became steady, his stance firm, his aim deliberate. Frank guided him through every shot, never criticizing, always demonstrating and encouraging. When the boy finally hit the target dead center, a small but genuine smile crossed his face. Frank nodded, approving but without fanfare. The satisfaction was in the success itself, not the recognition of others. The young Marines watched in silence, some shaking their heads in disbelief. One whispered to his friend, "I didn't think anyone could do that, not like that. Not calmly, like it was nothing." His friend nodded, equally awed. The demonstration was more than skill. It was history and expertise embodied in a man who had lived through situations far more dangerous than a training range. Frank's attention then turned to the other Marines. He picked up another rifle and fired a perfect sequence, demonstrating the principles of focus, control, and situational awareness. Each shot was deliberate, precise, and efficient. The demonstration was more than just marksmanship. It was a lesson in presence, patience, and the art of discipline. The young Marines were captivated. They had expected a simple visit. Instead, they were witnessing a master at work, a living legend showing what dedication and experience could achieve. As the session continued, General Ross observed quietly, appreciating not only Frank's skill but the subtle way he mentored. He didn't shout, He didn't command attention. He simply acted, and the results spoke for themselves. The general understood that what Alex was learning was far more valuable than mere marksmanship. He was learning confidence, focus, and the quiet power of preparation and discipline. The session reached a peak when Frank and Alex worked together to hit a series of progressively difficult targets. Each success built the boys' confidence, each guided correction reinforced discipline, and each shot was a lesson in perseverance. By the end of the hour, Alex's earlier anxiety had been replaced by steady focus and competence. He had transformed from a struggling recruit into a young Marine who could trust in his own abilities. The young Marines who had observed the process were now in awe. They had learned a lesson far beyond the range. They had seen what mastery looked like, what patience could accomplish, and what true guidance meant. They had underestimated Frank Dalton once, but they would never make that mistake again. They had been witnesses to history in motion, and the lesson would remain with them far longer than any formal training session. Finally, Frank lowered his rifle, signaling the end of the session. He looked at Alex, pride in his eyes but tempered by humility. "Remember," he said softly, "skill is not just about hitting the target. It's about control, patience, and knowing yourself. Today you learned the beginning. Keep practicing, keep improving, and never forget the responsibility that comes with knowledge and skill." Alex nodded, a mixture of awe, respect, and gratitude evident on his face. He understood now that his grandfather was not just an elderly man from family stories. He was a master, a legend, and someone whose guidance carried immense weight. The black falcon patch on Frank's sleeve, once a symbol of mystery, now represented history, skill, and mentorship alive and present. The young Marine stood silently, watching the interaction, absorbing the lesson in its full depth. Their earlier mockery seemed almost inconceivable now. Frank Dalton had transformed the atmosphere of the base, demonstrating that true authority does not demand respect, it earns it quietly, through action, skill, and integrity. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the range in long shadows, Frank Dalton stepped back, lowering his rifle completely. The hour he had requested had passed, but the impact of his presence, skill, and guidance would echo far beyond that hour. The young Marines had learned more than marksmanship. They had learned the meaning of discipline, patience, and respect for experience. And for Alex Dalton, the lesson was personal, profound, and unforgettable. The firing range had fallen silent, the last echoes of gunfire fading into the evening air. Frank Dalton lowered his rifle, his calm demeanor unchanged, but the atmosphere around him had transformed completely. Where there had once been doubt, laughter, and underestimation, now there was respect, awe, and quiet reflection. The young Marines who had laughed at him hours earlier now stood in solemn acknowledgement of the man before them. Private Alex Dalton breathed heavily, his chest rising and falling with a mixture of excitement and relief. He had succeeded where he had failed before, guided by the quiet authority of his grandfather. He looked up at Frank, eyes wide, admiration etched across his youthful face. "Grandpa, I did it," he said, barely able to contain his emotion. Frank nodded, his expression warm but composed. "You did it yourself, son," he replied. "I only showed you the path. You walked it. Remember that." Around them, the other young Marines shifted uneasily, some still in disbelief. Corporal Jensen whispered to Private Sanders, I think I get it now. We thought we knew what we were dealing with, we didn't. This isn't just a veteran. This is history, living history." Sanders nodded silently, still processing what he had seen. They had witnessed something far beyond ordinary training, a demonstration of mastery, patience, and quiet authority that left no room for mockery or doubt. General Ross remained near Frank, observing both the demonstration and its effects. He had seen countless soldiers excel, but few had the ability to command respect so effortlessly. "Sergeant Dalton," he said quietly, almost reverently, "you've given them more than skill today. You've given them understanding, discipline, and perspective. That's more valuable than any marksmanship score." Frank inclined his head, acknowledging the compliment but offering no words of pride. He had long learned that actions, not words, were the true measure of accomplishment. The young Marine slowly approached, hesitant at first, then with increasing confidence. They wanted to speak, to ask questions, to express admiration, but the respect in the air was palpable, and no one wished to break the solemnity of the moment. Each step forward was cautious, as if approaching a figure from legend whose presence demanded acknowledgement. Private Jensen finally spoke, voice low but firm. "Sergeant Dalton, we didn't understand before. We laughed, we underestimated you. But now we see. You're incredible, what you've done, what you've survived, it's more than we could imagine." His words were genuine, filled with humility. Frank looked at him, eyes calm, and nodded slightly. "You've learned a lesson today. Respect is earned, not assumed," he said quietly. The words were simple, yet they carried the weight of a lifetime. The evening sun cast long shadows across the range, bathing the scene in a golden light. Frank turned to his grandson, who now held the rifle with newfound confidence. "Alex," he said, voice soft, "remember this moment. Not for the success, but for the effort, the patience, and the learning. That's what makes a Marine, not just hitting the target." Alex nodded, understanding the deeper meaning beyond the technical skill. General Ross stepped closer, addressing the assembled Marines. "You've all witnessed something remarkable today. This is what true mastery looks like. It isn't flashy, it isn't loud, it's precise, patient, and effective, and it comes with humility." The young Marines absorbed his words, the lesson sinking in as they reflected on their earlier behavior. The contrast between their mockery and Frank's quiet authority was stark, unforgettable, and humbling. Frank's calm presence had shifted the energy of the base entirely. Officers and recruits alike recognized that they were witnessing a man whose life had been defined by extraordinary skill, courage, and dedication. The patch on his sleeve, the Black Falcon of the legendary Falcon Recon Unit, was no longer just a symbol. It was proof of a life lived at the highest levels of service, discipline, and sacrifice. As the sun dipped lower, the shadows stretching across the range, Frank approached General Ross privately. "Thank you for allowing me this hour," he said softly. "I only wanted to guide him, nothing more. I didn't expect recognition, and I don't need it." Ross nodded, understanding fully. "Sergeant Dalton, you've given more than you know, not just to him but to everyone who witnessed this today. That's the measure of your impact." Meanwhile, the other Marines had begun discussing the events quietly among themselves. One whispered, "I never thought I'd see someone like him in real life, and not just survive, but teach. And with that calm, that presence." Another nodded in agreement, adding, "It's like he's untouchable, but not because of arrogance, because of skill, experience, and patience." The words echoed the respect that had silently filled the range. Frank returned to his grandson, placing a reassuring hand on Alex's shoulder. "The work doesn't end here," he said. "You've learned the first lesson today. Remember it, keep practicing, keep improving, and never forget that patience, preparation, and understanding are as important as skill." Alex looked up, eyes shining with admiration, and nodded solemnly. He now understood that his grandfather was not merely a veteran, but a master whose life had been shaped by extraordinary circumstances, and whose guidance was a rare privilege. The young Marines lined up to shake Frank's hand, offering respect that was earned, not assumed. Each handshake carried a mixture of humility, awe, and gratitude. The laughter of the morning seemed like a distant memory, replaced by a collective understanding of what it meant to truly earn respect. General Ross observed quietly, his expression thoughtful. He had seen many great Marines, but few had the ability to command authority, respect, and attention without seeking it. Frank Dalton's presence had reminded everyone of a fundamental truth. Leadership is shown through action, not words. Skill is demonstrated through patience, not force. And respect is earned through consistency, humility, and quiet authority. As the hour concluded, Frank handed the rifle back to the armory personnel. He had requested it for a purpose, fulfilled it, and now returned it without ceremony. The act was simple, yet symbolic. The mission was complete, the lesson delivered, and the respect earned. Alex turned to his grandfather, a mixture of pride, gratitude, and awe on his face. "Grandpa, I don't know what to say." Frank smiled faintly, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "You don't need to say anything, just remember what you've learned. That's enough." The young Marines gathered around, some still quiet, some whispering reflections, all transformed by what they had witnessed. They had laughed earlier, underestimated a man, and been humbled in ways they would never forget. The presence of Frank Dalton, the living legend, had left an indelible mark on their perception of skill, patience, and the value of mentorship. General Ross stepped forward, nodding toward Frank. "Sergeant Dalton, your impact today goes beyond marksmanship. You've reminded us all why discipline, patience, and humility are the foundations of our corps. Your grandson is fortunate, and so are we." Frank inclined his head, acknowledging the words but offering no response beyond a quiet nod. The sun finally set, bathing the base in the soft light of evening. Shadows stretched across the firing range, carrying the weight of a day that would be remembered. Frank Dalton, his grandson, the young Marines, and the general all understood the magnitude of what had occurred. The laughter and underestimation of the morning had transformed into respect, awe, and reflection. History had walked among them, quietly, deliberately, and without fanfare. As Frank prepared to leave the range, he paused to look back at the young Marines. "Remember," he said quietly, "respect is not demanded, skill is not about pride, and lessons are not always easy to recognize. But when you see them, embrace them. That is the mark of a true Marine." And with that, Frank Dalton, living legend, master of skill and patience and quiet guide to the next generation, walked away from the range. The young Marines watched in silence, transformed not just by his skill, but by his humility, his presence, and the lessons he imparted without fanfare. The laughter of the morning was gone. In its place was understanding, respect, and the knowledge that they had witnessed something extraordinary. As night fell across the base, a calm settled over the Marines and officers who had witnessed the day's events. The firing range, once filled with tension, nervous laughter, and disbelief, now held a quiet reverence. Frank Dalton had returned to the armory to check out the rifle he had requested, but his purpose was complete. He had guided his grandson, impressed upon the young Marines the value of patience and discipline, and reminded everyone present why respect must be earned, not assumed. Alex Dalton, still gripping the rifle with newfound confidence, looked up at his grandfather. "Grandpa, I feel different now. I know I can do this," he said, voice trembling with a mix of awe and pride. Frank nodded, placing a reassuring hand on Alex's shoulder. "You can, son," he replied, voice calm but full of quiet authority. "But remember, confidence without humility is nothing. Skill without patience is wasted. Always respect what you do and those around you." General Ross approached, his face calm but thoughtful. "Sergeant Dalton," he said softly, "today you've reminded us all why legends like you are rare. Not because of the battles you've fought or the missions you've completed, but because of the lessons you impart quietly without ego. That's the mark of a true leader." Frank inclined his head, acknowledging the words, but remained humble. Recognition had never been his purpose. Action and guidance were enough. The young Marines who had once mocked him now approached individually, some hesitant, others brimming with curiosity. One young private whispered, "I can't believe we underestimated him," and laughed. "We were fools." Another nodded, adding, "He didn't just teach marksmanship, he taught us respect, patience, and what it means to be a Marine." The respect in their voices was genuine, the humility sincere. Frank had transformed them without a single raised voice, without drama, simply by being who he was. Frank's presence had an almost magnetic effect. The black falcon patch on his sleeve, once a symbol of fear and secrecy, had become a symbol of legacy, discipline, and quiet authority. Officers and Marines alike could feel the weight of his experience. Every scar, every line on his face, every deliberate movement carried a story, a history, a testament to the life he had led and the missions he had survived. Yet he offered none of that as spectacle. He simply acted, and the lessons were absorbed naturally. Alex's eyes lingered on the patch. "I didn't know what it meant before," he said softly. "Now I understand. It's everything you've done, all the sacrifices, and still you guide me without expecting anything in return." Frank smiled faintly. "It's not about the past," he said. "It's about what comes next. You carry the lessons forward. That's how legacy works." The words were simple yet profound, carrying decades of experience distilled into a moment. General Ross observed the exchange quietly, reflecting on the extraordinary nature of the man before him. "You've done more than teach marksmanship today," he said softly. "You've demonstrated the essence of leadership, patience, and courage. The young Marines will remember this for the rest of their lives." Frank simply nodded, knowing that the impact of his actions would outlast the fleeting moments of recognition. The real measure of success was not in medals or ceremonies. It was in the transformation of those he guided. The evening air was cool, carrying with it the faint scent of spent gunpowder and the earthy aroma of the base. Frank took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the range and the faces of the Marines around him. The respect in their expressions, the quiet reverence, and the awe in Alex's eyes, all of it was a reminder that actions, patience, and humility had lasting power. History wasn't just recorded in documents and photographs. It lived in moments like this, in lessons passed quietly from one generation to the next. Frank turned to Alex. "Remember this night," he said. "Not for the shots you fired, not for the target you hit, but for the patience, focus, and respect that allowed you to succeed. Those are the qualities that will serve you throughout your life. Guard them, nurture them, and pass them on." Alex nodded solemnly, absorbing the full weight of his grandfather's guidance. The young Marines gathered in small clusters, quietly discussing what they had witnessed. They were awed, humbled, and inspired. The lesson had been clear. Skill and authority were earned through patience, experience, and integrity, not through loud boasts or assumed power. Frank Dalton had demonstrated this without theatrics or demands, and the impact would resonate long after the sun had set. Even the base officers, accustomed to authority and achievement, were visibly affected. They had seen countless veterans, but few had carried themselves with the quiet confidence, humility, and mastery that Frank exhibited. The Black Falcon patch was not merely an insignia. It was a symbol of history, resilience, and the enduring value of dedication. Its meaning had transformed in the eyes of everyone present. As night fully settled, General Ross stepped forward, addressing the assembled Marines. "What you've seen today is rare," he said, voice calm but commanding attention. "A man who has lived through extraordinary circumstances, mastered his skills, and now passes on wisdom without seeking recognition. This is what it means to be a Marine, a leader, and a teacher. Take these lessons to heart. Let them guide you as they will guide others through you." Frank Dalton watched silently, observing the reactions, the understanding, and the respect he had earned. He had come to the base for one reason: to guide his grandson and help him succeed. But in doing so, he had reminded everyone present of fundamental truths. Patience matters, respect is earned, and true skill speaks louder than words. His presence had altered perspectives, humbled egos, and left a legacy of quiet, profound influence. Alex, feeling both pride and deep respect, approached his grandfather once more. "Grandpa, I'll never forget this. Thank you," he said earnestly. Frank placed a hand on his shoulder, smiling faintly. "The honor is mine, son. Remember what you've learned. Carry it forward, not just in marksmanship, but in life. That's the true measure of what we do." The young Marines filed out quietly, leaving the range in respectful silence. The laughter, mockery, and doubt of earlier in the day were gone, replaced by understanding and admiration. History had walked among them, and they had witnessed it, not in books or photographs, but in the presence of a living legend who had acted with humility, patience, and precision. As Frank and Alex walked back toward the barracks, the grandfather and grandson shared a quiet moment of reflection. The Black Falcon patch glinted faintly in the moonlight, a reminder of missions completed, challenges overcome, and lessons learned. Its meaning had expanded from secretive valor to living legacy, symbolizing the enduring power of guidance, patience, and quiet authority. General Ross watched from a distance, quietly acknowledging the profound effect of Frank Dalton's visit. He had seen many veterans, many heroes, and many skilled Marines, but few had commanded respect and imparted lessons with such subtle, enduring impact. The day had been transformative, not because of weapons or combat, but because of mastery, humility, and the quiet transmission of wisdom from one generation to the next. Finally, Frank Dalton paused at the edge of the base, looking back at the range, the Marines, and the officers. The day's work was complete. He had fulfilled his purpose, guided his grandson, and reminded everyone present of the principles that truly mattered: patience, discipline, humility, and respect. The Black Falcon patch, once a symbol of fear and secrecy, had become a beacon of guidance and legacy. And with that, Frank Dalton, living legend and master of skill and mentorship, walked away from the range and the base, leaving behind a transformed group of Marines, a proud grandson, and a legacy that would echo far beyond the fading moonlight. History had come alive, lessons had been passed down, and respect had been earned, not through words but through action, patience, and quiet mastery.